The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Thursday, February 20th, 2020. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live 2 tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. Ladies and gentlemen, one of our famous on vacation, but the show's not on vacation shows. And today is 02-20-2020. I guess that doesn't mean anything, really. And nobody cares. What's that?
It's a lot of 2s and 0s.
It's exclusively 0s and 2s. Not just a lot. It's the most 0s and 2s you can have in a date, Matt.
It's pretty significant.
It is. If there were 20 months in the year, you'd get a 2020, 20, 20, 20. But instead we have 02, 20, 20, 20. Look, this is why people tune into the show. They're learning something. It's fascinating stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, on the program today, the hidden history of the war on voting. Who stole your vote? How to get it back, by the great Thom Hartmann. He's got a whole hidden history series that he's been working on. Fascinating stuff and some actionable stuff. The history of the war on voting. Look, I got some bad news for you. They never really wanted a lot of you to vote. Back in the day, back in this day, they didn't want a lot of you to vote. It's a tougher way to maintain, and this came up the other day, Straussians. Part of like the Chicago school. I'm surprised you don't know this, Matt. I'm a little bit, it was Leo Strauss. He was born, I believe, I don't know, right at the turn of the century, the last century. And it was, it's a big strand of conservatism that is very much in loco parentis, as it were, paternalistic. And I think arguably the authoritarian. A lot of folks referred to like, a Cheney and whatnot, Straussians. But that doesn't come up at all.
Would Bill Barr be a Straussian?
Maybe. I need to dig into that. But a lot of the neocons and the right-wingers. But they didn't want you to vote, ladies and gentlemen. But it is supposedly the way they pitch America, right? I mean, the greatest democracy. So just to catch up, also, hopefully I did a little bit of a recap of the debate that took place last night. You can find that on YouTube, and I will put it into the streams. Won't be fancy, but it will be there, folks. So check that out as well. In the meantime, sit back, enjoy this, the hidden history of the war on voting, who stole your vote, and how to get it back. Tomorrow on the program, we have really interesting history of black labor in the country and stuff I did not know. We have some weird associations, but some interesting dynamics that took place. Black labor through really 3 or 4 centuries of this country. And that is with Professor Joe William Trotter. And we will also have an interview that I did with Chris Coons, challenger in Delaware. Chris Coons is one of those senators that we really don't want to deal with, believe me. All right, folks, quick break and then back with the secret war on voting. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program someone who has been a role model for me for many, many years, too many years, frankly, at this point. Thom Hartmann, New York Times bestselling author, of course, the host of the Thom Hartmann Show, and author of the latest in his series, the Hidden History series. This one is The War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back. Thom, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Sam, it's always great talking to you. We go, people may not know, we go all the way back to Air America, back to like 2004 or 5 or something like that. I mean,
That's right. And
it's been a good ride.
And I should also just mention, which I think should be of interest to our audience. You have been doing a weekly sort of, I guess, I don't know what to call it really, like interview, but also taking calls with Bernie Sanders for almost as long, probably as long as that time, right? I mean, you've been doing this for over 15 years. 11 years.
Yeah. Well, Bernie dropped off the show 4 years ago when he ran against Hillary, and he has been replaced. He hasn't come back. He's been replaced by Congressman Mark Pocan, who's the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, who does now middays with Mark every Wednesdays. And Congressman Ro Khanna comes on every other week and takes calls for an hour. But for 11 years, Bernie was here every single Friday. The Friday after Thanksgiving, the Friday at Christmas once. I mean, it's just insane. He is the Energizer Bunny, and he took, unscreened calls for a full hour every single week for 11 years. He's a good guy.
All right. Well, so let's talk about your latest book, The War on Voting. This is fascinating. I mean, I'm particularly interested in, where this starts around the Civil War. I've become really fascinated by Reconstruction in particular. And let's talk about that. Well, let's even go back further. I mean, when the country was founded, there was a real desire not to necessarily have everybody vote or have everybody's vote as valuable as some people's vote.
Yeah, in fact, this was a debate at the Constitutional Convention, or a discussion. John Adams and some of the high Federalists, the conservatives of their day, thought that the only people who should be allowed to vote were people who are property owners. I shouldn't say people, I should say men. In fact, Adams's wife, Abigail, sent him a letter saying, don't forget the ladies. And he sent back a letter saying, we will not sacrifice our manly prerogatives. And then she sent him back a letter saying, the women may revolt. It was fascinating. But the fact of the matter is, when they said all men are created equal, they meant men, and specifically white men. So, but nonetheless, white male property owners were the ones that the Federalists wanted to vote. And then the Anti-Federalists, the Jefferson faction, they didn't quite call themselves Federalists and Anti-Federalists in 1787 when they were hammering out the convention, but it was fairly obvious to see where people were going to end up. The Anti-Federalists, the Jefferson faction, was everybody should be able to vote, poor people, indebted people, with the obvious exception of women and people of color. And that's what we ended up with.
But we never really...
Although I should add, some states actually had restrictions, property-based restrictions on voting. You couldn't vote unless you brought, for example, a property tax receipt or proof that you owned property. There were a handful of states, I think it was about a half a dozen states, that had restrictions like that right up until around the 1830s. And interestingly, it was the candidacy or the presidency, but largely the candidacy of Andrew Jackson, who blew that up. It was one of the things that he campaigned on, even though he had no control over it at the federal level, or minimal control. He ran a very, very populist campaign, the first real populist campaign. It was based on racism and everything else, just like Trump. I mean, Andrew Jackson was not a good guy, Trail of Tears and everything else. But part of his campaign was allowing working people who did not own property to vote, and it essentially shamed this handful of states into doing away with those laws. They were all gone by the late 1830s, early 1840s.
But I mean, the idea that shame was the only tool ultimately that Jackson had at that point is indicative of the lack of a federal right to vote.
That's correct. There is no, to quote John Rehnquist, in 2000 in the Bush v. Gore decision, when George Bush sued Al Gore, saying that if the count in Florida was actually accurately recounted, it would cause, quote, irreparable harm to complainant George W. Bush, end quote. Rehnquist said in the decision, there is no federal constitutional right to vote for president of the United States. And the reason why, of course, is because they were picking and choosing who their voters were from the beginning.
And that has really been the sort of, I don't maybe the original sin. I mean, I want to say that it's one of those. It's a feature, not a bug. But that has really been the heart of the problem. But before we get to that, and sort of like any type of attempts by the federal government, let's move up to the Civil War and start with the Three-Fifths Compromise and the sort of I don't know, I guess there's sort of a paradox about that, but remind us what that is and how it plays into how we know the vote today.
Well, it was about power for the South. One of the reasons why I think of the first dozen or so presidents that we had who were not named Adams, all of them were slaveholders. And it was because the Three-Fifths Compromise essentially gave a little more political power in both the electoral and in the House of Representatives to the slave states. And the way it worked was, and this was in mid-July in 1787 in Philadelphia when they were debating this, and the issue came up: how many people do you have to have in a congressional district in order to, or let me rephrase that. Say you've got a state with 100,000 people in it, 100,000 white people in it. How many congressional districts do you get? And let's say it was 33,000 for a congressional district, your state would get 3. So they hammered that stuff out, and then the southern states said, okay, cool, we've got, in Georgia, the population of whites and blacks was about 50-50 at that point in time. And there were, large counties that were more black than white. And so the southern guys said, but wait a minute, you've got to count our slaves in order to give us, more seats in the House of Representatives. And the guys from the North said, no way, your slaves can't vote. They don't have any rights. They can't own property. They're not participants in this republic. So, what justification do we have in giving you a member of Congress to represent people who can't be represented or who don't have the power to express their desires? And this became the thing that might have taken down the Constitution. And compromise was reached, and that compromise was that for purposes of the number of members of the House of Representatives that each state had, they would count the entire white population plus 3/5 of the enslaved people, with the exception of Native Americans. They wouldn't count the Native Americans. And it wasn't, people say, well, they said black people were 3/5. It was in some ways even more.
I'm sorry, wait, Tom. I'm sorry, you're breaking up there again. Can you say that again? It wasn't that people were saying that black people were worth 3/5 of white people. It was what?
Yeah, it wasn't that the founders were saying a black person is 3/5 of a white person. It was actually worse than that. They were saying that slaveholders and slaveholding states would have more political power, more representation in the House of Representatives because of their slave populations than the northern states that didn't have or had very, very marginal or minimal slave populations. And the way that has really impacted us is the Electoral College. The Electoral College, the idea behind the Electoral College in part came from the old Whig histories. These were the histories of England before the Roman invasion around 200 BC. And those histories, Paul de Rapin de Torras was the most famous of the historians of this, and Jefferson was completely in love with these histories because they were about his people, the red-haired people who lived in the British Isles, that they were all tribal. They lived tribally. They had their own religion, their own language, Christianity, and not much Christianity didn't exist at that point in time. And the various tribes would get together once a year and have a council. They called it the Wicke-Gemeinschaft, and because the language they spoke was actually based on German, and people would travel and go to this council, and they would be like the wise elders, the Council of Wise Elders. Jefferson saw the same thing. Of course, he wasn't the Constitutional Convention, but he had a heavy influence. Saw the same thing among the Iroquois, that of all 5 Iroquois nations, once a year they would have this kind of get together, and in 4 of those 5 nations, only the women could vote, and the 5th one, both men and women could vote. And but they would elect a wise elder who would go and represent them, and it would be somebody that they could trust to do the right thing, say the right thing, even though ultimately that person didn't have decision-making power. They'd have to come back and say, here's what happened. So the idea of the Electoral College was kind of twofold. One, that
Sorry, Tom, we lost you again. You said the Electoral College was twofold. What were the two?
Yeah, the purpose of the Electoral College was twofold. One was so that people could have some. Back in that day, it would take 2-3 days to travel up the Eastern Seaboard by horse or carriage. And so the idea of average voters getting to know the presidential candidates was pretty far out there.
Right.
Pretty much the only way you knew the candidates was by the newspapers. And the newspapers all had a pretty clear bias. And so the idea was we'll insert somebody into that process who is a trusted member of the community. So your community would choose an elector, and that elector would actually physically go to Washington, D.C. They would get to know the candidates. And if, your community voted for candidate A, and the elector got up to Washington, D.C. and met candidate A and found out that the guy was a drunk or whatever, or worse, he would say, screw it, I'm going to vote for candidate B. And that's why the electors are not actually bound to what the people who elected them voted, the person that they voted for, the so-called faithless elector. So there was, it was these two parts. Number one, we want a trusted person intermediary. And then the second part was the concern that defining a scoundrel, identifying a scoundrel so that you could avoid that, which kind of failed us in 2016.
Indeed. I guess we're just living with the legacy of that on some level, right? I mean, we don't really, theoretically, we don't really need that system anymore.
That's absolutely correct. In fact, there's a program called the National Popular Vote. Our website is nationalpopularvote.com, where individual states commit that when enough states have signed this agreement, and so far it's been enacted into law in 16 jurisdictions with 196 electoral votes. And when they hit the threshold of the number of electoral votes that you need in order to elect the president, and as I recall, that's 270 something.
Yeah,
but,
270.
Sorry, I don't have it. Yeah. That when they've got 270 electoral votes, and so far they've got California, Colorado, Connecticut, D.C., Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Washington. So if you didn't hear your state's still in play. When they've got that 270 votes, then all those states agree that whatever candidate wins the majority vote in the United States, as Al Gore did in 2000, as Hillary Clinton did in 2016, whichever candidate wins that majority vote, that's the candidate that those states will give their electors to, regardless of how the citizens in those states voted. So we'll have a true national vote. And the principal institution that has been fighting this has been the Republican Party.
Now, what do you? I mean, this is getting a little bit off track, but what are the constitutional arguments? Are there any against this? Just to be clear with people, basically, what you have is. We don't know exactly the number of states it would be, but a number of states who have amongst themselves 270 electorates, and they just make a pact. It's just an agreement. It's just a contract, essentially, where we all agree to award our electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote, as you say. But is there a constitutional argument against that?
No, there is none. The Electoral College is such an anomaly, and it was provided outside of the debates in Philadelphia, where you can read what these guys, what they were thinking, what their rationale were. But beyond that, there's no argument in favor of it that is embedded in concepts like democracy, or majority vote or majority rule or anything like that. They were trying to figure out how to do a nation. We were at that point arguably one of the largest nations in the world, physically, and so they were just trying to deal with that. So what's going on right now, Sam, is Republicans are actually trying to pass a law. And I don't recall if it's a law or a constitutional amendment. You'd think it would have to be a constitutional amendment, but I believe that it's just a simple law that would blow this up, that would exercise federal prerogative over the states and say that the states, that the idea of faithless electors is now illegal. Electors must vote for the person that their state, voted for. They're trying to get around this right now as we speak. I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
Right. It would be such a bizarre law because we don't have this federal right to vote. And, that takes us up into Reconstruction, where we had the 13th and 14th Amendments, which ostensibly were to basically enfranchise former slaves and give them the right to vote. But the and we've talked a little bit about on this program about, the radical Republicans at the time and the attempts to do this. And there was a big compromise that basically one of the options was to make it a federal right to vote. And then it would be very hard to abridge regardless of your status, and they did not do that. They simply stopped at the idea that you cannot be disenfranchised because of race. And to a certain extent, that left open the interpretation for those who wanted to sort of say, like, well, how do we establish that you've been prevented from race? Because from about, I guess, the late 1800s, maybe it was the early 1900s up until 1965, in some places, states were allowed to impose, essentially like literacy tests and poll taxes because there was no direct relationship, or it was not proven that they were trying to do this because of race. And then that was changed with the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, that's in part because they were still trying to prevent half the population from voting, women. And in fact, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton both aggressively campaigned against the 14th Amendment when it was being debated in Congress because it had the word male in it. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, if that word male is allowed into the Constitution, it'll take 100 years to remove it. And that was 1873, as I recall. And I think it was 1973, 100 years, almost exactly 100 years later. This is in my book, Unequal Protection, which I wrote like 15 years ago. So I'm not recalling the details exactly. But it was about 100 years later that the right of women in the United States broadly was enshrined. I mean, obviously in 1920 women got the right to vote, but the laws against discrimination. And of course, we still don't have the Equal Rights Amendment.
Let's jump ahead here, and I will say, just like that era following Reconstruction and this era, in terms of the Supreme Court beginning to allow more and more mechanisms in which to disenfranchise people is pretty striking. And you write extensively about sort of the modern process of disenfranchising. Let's talk about this. I hadn't been aware of this, and I'm trying to find it here in my notes. The red. Bear with me here. It is the. Gosh, I have it here. Sorry. It is the red shift. Talk to us about the red shift.
Yeah, this is something that we really started noticing with the 2000 election, particularly in Florida, that we've been doing exit polling in the United States since the late 1950s, and we were among the leaders in the world in turning it from basically a crude. I mean, exit polling goes back to literally back to the 1800s, but in the modern era, we had by the 1970s or thereabouts, we had turned it into a science. And it's now used all over the world. You know, the European countries, they all vote on paper. It typically takes 2, 3, 4 days to count the vote. You recall when Boris Johnson was elected in the UK just a few months ago, it took, I believe, 3 days to count the entire vote. But they announced the results of the election within hours of the polls closing. And the way, and when I lived in Germany, same deal in Germany. You have to physically count the ballots. In fact, it's like jury duty in Germany. You get called up by the government, just like on jury duty. You get a notice in the mail, and you must present yourself at the polls to be either a poll watcher or a vote counter. But it can take, like I said, 2 or 3 days and you get exempted from having to work on those days. But it can take a couple of days to count the vote. But their exit polls are always within 0.1% or 0.2%. And so unless the race is like super, super close, it's always called the night of the election. And then, the counting of the vote is more of a formality. So same thing here in the United States. The exit polls and the elections always pretty much lined up. And then in 2000 in Florida, there was this huge discrepancy between the exit polls, which showed that Al Gore clearly won Florida, and the actual tabulated total, which said that he had lost by 500 and some odd votes. So that perked up a lot of our ears. And then in 2002, it got a little worse. And then in the 2004 election, it was huge, the red shift. And we call it red shift because it always this shift between the exit polls and the actual tabulated votes always favored the Republicans, the red team. And particularly in Ohio in 2004, the exit polls showed that John Kerry easily beat George W. Bush, but not what the Secretary of State told us. And back in the day, and this is when, you and I were starting with Air America and stuff like this, many of us, in fact, I wrote about this fairly extensively, were concluding that this must be rigged voting machines. And for the better part of a decade, a lot of us were convinced that it was rigged voting machines that were being hacked or programmed or whatever. It was pretty much exclusively happening in Republican-controlled states. But you saw red shifts of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%. We took down the government of Ukraine because of a discrepancy, as I recall, 2.5 or 3%. It's in my book. A small discrepancy between the exit poll and the actual tabulated vote, and said the exit polls proved that there was fraud, and that provoked the whole Orange Revolution, which took down the bad guy and put up the good guy. And I'm sorry I don't recall all their names. So exit polls, the Carter Center uses them, the United Nations uses them. Exit polls are the gold standard to know whether an election is fair and free or whether it's fraudulent. And when we started seeing this red shift, it started freaking these people out, particularly Mitofsky Edison, the biggest company that was doing exit polling. And after the 2004 election, they were like trying to figure out how do we justify this? And Mitofsky came up with this theory of the shy Republican voter, because it wasn't happening in democratically controlled states. In the states that were controlled by the Democratic Party, the election polls and the exit polls always were the same. And so he concluded that the Republican Party had gotten sufficiently toxic that when people walked out of the voting booth, they were simply embarrassed to tell the pollster that they had voted for the Republican candidate. But that didn't explain why this was always the case in Florida and never the case in New York State or Vermont. I mean, the Republicans are Republicans, right? And then the penny dropped in the 2010s, and I learned about, or at least that's when I learned about this, in 2002, which was kind of the turning point for all this redshift stuff. In 2002, a friend of mine, Bob Ney, a former Republican congressman from Ohio, who is now very much reformed Republican, helped write the Help America Vote Act. And one of the things, which was the law that gave $5.5 billion to the states to buy electronic voting machines so we wouldn't have pregnant chads anymore, right, or dimpled chads or pimpled chads. But there was a provision in that law, and Bob told me about this on the air. In fact, he said, we wanted to make sure that if somebody showed up to vote and, thought that they could legitimately vote and thought that they were registered and everything, but their name didn't happen to be on the voting rolls, that they could at least leave their intent. They could cast a ballot. It might not be counted if it turns out that they weren't a legitimate voter, but that they could cast a ballot. And these things were called provisional ballots. And so if you are not registered to vote in your state and you go show up at the polls and they look on the list and they say, well, you're not on the list, and you say, but I'd like to vote anyway, they will give you a ballot. And it looks just like all the other ballots. It's identical in every regard, except it goes in a different envelope. And it's called a provisional ballot. You vote that ballot. It goes into a pile of provisional ballots, and they are literally never counted. The only time provisional ballots are counted is if an election is contested. And even then, they typically have very little impact, because if you are given a provisional ballot and you vote it, you have different states have different laws on this, so it varies from 2 to 5 or 6 days. But you have a small window of time in which you have to present yourself to the Secretary of State's office or the local election official's office, depending on the state, and with your driver's license and your birth certificate and any change of name stuff if you've been married, all this kind of stuff, to prove who you are and proof of your residence and proof that at one point you were legally registered to vote. And when you do all that, then they'll go find your provisional ballot and pull it out, and it'll actually get counted, or at least in theory, it'll get counted if the election is contested, because by that point, the election's already been called. And so this makes perfect sense now. Brian Kemp throws almost 1 million people off the voting rolls in Georgia, a couple 100,000 just in the year before he goes up against Stacey Abrams. And while the exit polls, again, are showing that Stacey Abrams won the election, Brian Kemp somehow magically won the election. How is it that the exit polls are different? Well, they're different for a very simple reason. People who vote provisional ballots assume that their vote is going to be counted. Nobody tells them this isn't going to be counted. So they walk out. The exit pollster says, "Who did you vote for?" "Oh, I voted for Stacey Abrams." Cool. Write it down. And this explains redshift. And the states that are most aggressively purging voters from the voting rolls. For example, Brian Kemp provided the Georgia voting list to Rick Snyder in Michigan, to the governor of Michigan. And because the African-American and Hispanic name pools are small, African-American names, the vast majority of them were derived from a small subset of white Southern, either Scottish, Irish, or English ancestry, English-speaking slave owners. So the name pool is pretty much exclusively out of English. Something like 80% of all people named Washington in the United States, for example, are black. So that name pool is small. And the Hispanic name pool comes entirely out of the Spanish language. And so it's a small name pool. Whereas if you look at the Caucasian population, you've got people who are Serbian and Croat and, obviously English and German and French and Czech. And, there's dozens of languages that these names are drawn from. So it's hugely diverse, the white people's name list. So if you take, 1 million voters from Georgia and compare them with 1 million voters in Michigan and look for people who have the same name or similar names, James Johnson in Georgia, James L. Johnson in Michigan, Jimmy Johnson in Michigan, James Johnson in Georgia, what you're going to find is that the hits, what appears to be the same person in both states, are going to be massively skewed toward black people and Hispanic people. And so, without going out and saying, "Oh, we're going to throw all the black people off the voting rolls," that's what they do. And Greg Palast has documented 60,000 African Americans in Michigan just before the election where Trump won Michigan by in the neighborhood of 20,000 votes. 60,000 African Americans who were thrown off the voting rolls in Michigan because somebody with a name similar to theirs was on the voting rolls in Georgia.
This is cross-check, correct? I mean, this is what is known as cross-check. This is the Chris Kobach sort of strategy.
Well, except this happened after Chris Kobach kind of pulled back on it. I mean, now these states are just doing it on their own with each other, but it was institutionalized. And the very first iteration of this that we saw was the 2000 election, where George W. Bush, his brother Jeb, was the governor of Florida, and so he says to his Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, buy a list of felons from Texas. Now, in Texas, about 60% of the felons are black or Hispanic. And so there's that very small name pool. And he took this felon list from Texas and compared it with the voter list in Florida, and every name that was even similar, not even identical, they struck off the Florida voting rolls. And so somewhere between 30,000 and 90,000 African Americans, and maybe even more than that. This is, different people have different ways of estimating these numbers, were removed from the voting rolls in Florida just in the months before the election. And that was enough to get George Bush within 500 votes of winning.
Now, do we know if those people voted on provisional ballots?
No, they didn't have provisional ballots in 2000. They were simply turned away.
Okay.
And there were huge protests. You'll recall the NAACP was, doing marches all over the state. They were raising hell. It didn't get much covered. It was like a one-week story. But, lawsuits went on for a decade and may still be going on for all I know.
And so the theory is that in this day and age, when that happens, the people they have a provisional ballot. So when they go out and they tell exit pollsters, who'd you vote for? I voted. And the exit pollsters don't realize, like, oh, well, that vote may not count. Now, do we know what percentage of all ballots cast are provisional, and to what extent any of those are counted?
It depends on the state. The states that are aggressively purging the voter rolls are in fact, let me grab my book here. I've got some statistics. The states that are aggressively purging the voter rolls, you'll see 3, 4, 5, 6% redshift, swing where the exit polls are different from the actual election. Here we go. In North Carolina, for example, this is just the last election, 2016. In North Carolina, the exit polls showed Hillary Clinton winning by almost 2 points, 48.6 to 46.5. But when they actually counted the vote, Trump had 49.9 to Clinton's 46.1. That's a redshift of 5.9 percentage points in North Carolina.
So does that mean that 5% of the votes were provisional and none of them were counted?
Yes. Well, probably a little more than 6%, actually.
But do we have that figure? But do we have that figure independently? Like, does North Carolina?
These numbers I'm giving you are solid. Here's a couple more. In Florida, in 2016, the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton won Florida, according to the exit polls, 47.7 to 46.4 for Trump. But when they actually counted the vote, it was 49% for Trump, 47.8% for Clinton. So the 2-point shift in Florida. In Pennsylvania, Clinton won according to 46.1%. But when you actually counted the so-called eligible votes, Trump carried the state 48.8% to Clinton's 47.6, a redshift of 5.6%. In Wisconsin, the redshift was 5.1%. And this is just in the 2016 election,
And so,
in fact, in the 2000,
go ahead.
In 2004, 22 states had redshift. All but one were Republican-controlled states. This is the Republicans. The GOP has been doing this ever since they got that provisional ballot thing built into the Help America Vote Act in 2002. This has been their strategy, and they're continuing to do it. And they're doing it aggressively. And now the Supreme Court has said it's perfectly legal. Ohio, Governor John Kasich wanted to throw a couple 100,000 people off the voting rolls in Ohio last year, and a bunch of Ohio voting activists were able to demonstrate that a lot of these people were, quote, mistakenly identified as having moved or died. They took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, hey, it's up to the states. This is not for us to meddle with. And so, within weeks of that, other Republican-controlled states around the country, and this is just in the last year, started aggressively purging their voting rolls.
So I'm looking at Florida right now. Apparently, in 2016, there were almost 25,000 provisional ballots cast, only 11,000 which were counted. And
I'm impressed that it was that many, and I'm surprised that were counted, and I'm surprised that it's that few that were cast. I'm not sure of the source of your numbers.
I'm just looking at this as a Miami, South Florida piece from 2018.
So you're probably looking at it. Are you looking at a county? Because those kind of numbers sound like you have in a large county, not in a state.
Oh, that's possible. It does not say. It does not say.
That might be like Miami-Dade County or something.
I see. Maybe that's just South Florida. And so those numbers align when you talk about that red shift, that theoretically the number of provisional ballots cast could make up those differences.
Yes.
So what do we do? I mean, do we need a federal, is it just as easy as like we need a federal statute that says, voting is a right, even if it's a statute. It doesn't have to be a constitution, right? I mean, voting is a right. If you're voting in a federal election, every provisional ballot must be counted, and the presumption must be legit unless they can be specifically challenged. Or, I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, what the Republicans figured out in 2000 in Florida, when Jeb Bush had thrown tens of thousands of African Americans off the voting rolls, and then after the election, those same people, pissed off, showed up in the streets with signs and making noise. What they figured out is we've got to figure out a way that people think that they voted. We can't just deny them the right to vote, because with those people in 2000, when they showed up at the polling place, they were told, "You're not on the list. See you later. Leave." So therefore, we got provisional ballots in 2002. I think we need to do away with provisional ballots. And we need to have an absolute right to vote, period. You have a right to vote. Now, you said it could be done by legislation. It actually was. In 1993, I'm forgetting the exact name of the law, but it was referred to as the Motor Voter Act. The Republicans fought this like crazy. This is the Clintons' first year. But it was a major accomplishment that allowed states, it didn't require them, but it allowed states to register people to vote at the time they got the driver's license. And the Republicans were all hysterical because A, they don't like people to vote. B, they were convinced. They said that they were convinced that you were going to have all kinds of non-citizens registering to vote, which didn't happen, by the way. Has never been demonstrated to have happened. But both in the preamble and in the body of that law, it says explicitly, voting is a right in the United States of America. Now, the problem is, and this is my previous book, in History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, the problem is that because the Supreme Court has not reviewed that law, it is not, it's not like the final law sort of thing. And so the Republicans have just felt free to ignore it. And the Democrats have not been litigating this. Now, Greg Powell has started litigating based on this, and actually just last week won a case against Brian Kemp in Georgia. But it wasn't a right to vote case that Greg won. It was a show me the purge lists and
right.
Your rationale and your justification for the purge lists. So we're starting to see a little bit of transparency through the courts. Starting to pry it out of the hands of these Republican vote snatchers. But you said, what do we do about it? Number one, obviously, a constitutional amendment would be the strongest thing that could be done because it couldn't be blown up by the Supreme Court. That was their rationale in the Ohio case, was they looked back at Bush v. Gore, the Ohio case last year, where they said, John Kasich can throw people off the voting rolls. They looked back at Bush v. Gore and said, well, there's no right to vote in the Constitution. And they ignored the Motor Voter Act. Well, they didn't even need to. I mean, they were only basing it on the Constitution. So, number one, if you could put a right to vote in the Constitution, that solves 99.9% of the problem. But that is, there have been 27,000 attempts to amend the Constitution 29,000 attempts to amend it since founding of the country, and only 27 amendments. So the second thing to do, and this is what you and I need to be doing, Sam, is we need to be shouting from the rooftops that if you show up at your polling place and you're given a provisional ballot, you walk out front with a bullhorn. You start yelling and screaming and raising absolute holy hell about that, because your vote will not count. You have been disenfranchised. I'm guessing 99% of Americans have no idea about this. And a lot of them may have voted provisional ballots already. So we need to expose this scam that is being done on the American people. This is the only way the Republicans are holding on to power. It's the only reason the Republicans control the Senate right now. It's the only reason the Republicans control the White House. And it's the only reason why they control probably at least 70 or 80 seats in the House of Representatives, is that they've been successful in these voter purges in these red states.
Wow.
A lot of these red states are actually purple. Like I said, Hillary, according to the exit polls, Hillary won she won Florida, she won Pennsylvania, but not by small margins, by large margins. And just gave it to Donald Trump. And so, it's like time to wake the hell up.
The hidden history of the war on voting, who stole your vote, and how to get it back, Thom Hartmann. We will put a link to that on the blog at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time, Thom. Always a pleasure.
Great talking with you, Sam. I always enjoy your show. Thanks so much.